Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Chris. I'm the co producer and editor of The Last Architect of Eterra, and this is the first episode in our series on the world of Eterra, the characters who move through it, and the deeper ideas buried under the story. This first episode is where I want to begin in the right way, not with a lore dump, not with a giant map explanation, not with a list of factions, systems, names, and terms that mean nothing yet. I want to begin with the feeling of the book. Because before Eterra becomes a world you understand, it becomes a world you feel. And the first thing you feel in Eterra is pressure, then fear, then silence. That is the real beginning of this series. The Last Architect of Eterra does not open like bright fantasy. It does not open in sunlight. It does not open in safety. It does not open with a clean heroic march into destiny. It opens underground. It opens in rust. It opens in hiding. It opens in a world where survival belongs to people who know how to make themselves smaller. Smaller in sound, smaller in motion, smaller in hope. That is why I wanted the title of this episode to be Why Eterra Begins in Silence. Because silence in this book is not peace. Silence is not comfort. Silence is not wisdom. Silence is pressure. Silence is control. Silence is what power demands from people it wants to flatten. And once you understand that, the whole opening of the novel starts to lock into place. Very early on, the book gives us one of its most important ideas. What was buried is never still. I love that line because it works on every level of the story. It works emotionally, it works politically, it works spiritually, it works physically. What was buried is never still. That means grief does not stay buried, fear does not stay buried, history does not stay buried, power does not stay buried, and in Eterra, the world itself does not stay buried. Something under everything is still moving, still waiting, still answering. That is the pulse of the whole series. And the emotional center of that beginning is Aelit. Aelit is such a strong entry point into this world because she is not introduced as a triumphant chosen one. She is introduced through fear, through concealment, through survival. As a child, she learns the logic of a terror in the worst possible way. She learns what happens when power notices you. She learns what the wardens do. She learns that order in this world is not clean, not noble, not protective. It is violent, cold, hollowing. It does not simply defeat people, it empties them. That is one of the most disturbing and effective things in the opening pages of the book. The wardens do not just kill, they leave order behind. Perfect order. That idea is horrifying, and it tells you immediately what kind of world this is. This is a world where being made harmless is treated like a virtue, where the living human core is the problem, where obedience is cleaner than humanity. And Alit survives that childhood trauma because she is told something brutally simple: become nothing, become dust in the cracks. Do not look, do not reach, disappear. That command shapes her life, and it shapes the opening of the story 10 years later. Because when we meet her again, she is still living inside that instruction. She is hiding in plain sight, working the system, changing identities, making herself forgettable, trying to survive one more day inside a world built to erase anomalies. That is why the checkpoint scene matters so much. It is not just an action scene. It is not just an inciting incident. It is the whole social logic of a terror in miniature, a line, a checkpoint, people staring down, people not speaking, people knowing that one mistake can become a sentence, one irregularity, one sound, one wrong reaction, one sign that something in you is still too alive. And then the system notices. Ali touches the railing. Frost blooms. The catcher feels the shift. The Mika guard arrive. And that is where the story truly ignites. Because that moment makes something very clear. Alit can no longer survive by only becoming smaller. The world has found her anyway. And when that happens, the buried thing answers back. The tuning fork returns. That object is one of my favorite things in the book because it is doing so much at once. It is memory, it is inheritance, it is fear, it is a bond to her father. It is an ancient instrument, it is a key, it is a weapon. It is also a form of translation. That matters because Aelit's power is not just raw force. It is dangerous when it is trapped, dangerous when it is suppressed, dangerous when it is forced inward. But the tuning fork gives it shape, it gives it direction, it turns agony into resonance, it turns chaos into answer. That is such a strong idea. It's especially in a book where silence has been used as a method of domination. Because the answer to that domination is not just louder violence, it is resonance, it is living pattern, it is the return of something that was not actually dead. And this is where I think the last architect of Eterra really separates itself from more familiar fantasy patterns. The power in this book does not feel decorative, it does not feel like a spell list. It feels physical, structural, acoustic. It feels like vibration, pressure, tuning, interruption, and release. It feels mythic, but it also feels engineered, ancient but precise. That combination gives the whole book a very distinctive identity. When Aelit finds the tuning fork again, it is not just a cool recovery scene, it is a recognition scene. Her blood answers it. It answers her. The world answers her. That is the crucial thing. The buried instrument has not been lying there as dead treasure. It has been waiting. And waiting is a huge part of the emotional language of this novel. The world has been waiting. History has been waiting. Aelit has been waiting, even if she does not think of it that way. And that is why the phrase, "what was buried is never," still feels less like a slogan and more like a law. Now, another reason I wanted episode 1 to focus on silence is because the book keeps building this contrast between dead control and living response. You see it everywhere. The warden's hollow, the checkpoints flatten, the system monitors, the city presses downward. Even the architecture feels like obedience turned into stone and metal. Eterra is not just a setting, it behaves like a damaged organism trapped inside a machine, or maybe a machine built on top of a living wound. That tension is all over the prose. The city does not rise, it burrows. That detail matters, because upward suggests openness, downward suggests pressure, concealment, burden, a world moving deeper into itself. And inside that downward world, Aelit carries something that does not want to stay buried. That is why she is such a compelling central figure, not only because she matters to the plot, but because her inner conflict is the same as the world's conflict. She has been trained to suppress, but something in her refuses suppression. She has learned concealment, but something in her is built to answer. She has survived through silence, but the force inside her is resonance. That Ed is elegant storytelling. Her private wound and the world's buried truth are part of the same structure. And then the book expands, first through Ronan, then through Kale. And that expansion is handled really well because it does not feel random. Ronan is the first sign that there are people who live outside the official logic of order, but he is not romanticized. He is not clean. He is not noble in some easy way. He is practical, hard, dangerous. He feels like a man shaped by survival at the bottom of a dying world. When he enters the story, the novel gets a little rougher, a little more grounded, a little more morally dangerous. That is exactly what it needs. Then Kale opens a different door. Kale is where the intellectual and buried historical dimension of the story starts to sharpen. Because once he sees the tuning fork, the book begins to say something bigger. Maybe the official story of Eterra is false or incomplete. Maybe the world is not what the ruling order says it is. Maybe beneath the doctrine of the false god, there is an older design, an older structure, an older purpose. That is where the star architects begin to matter. That is where the cradle begins to matter. That is where the series starts widening beyond hunted survival into buried cosmology. But what I like is that this widening does not break the emotional thread. It still stays tied to Aelit. It still stays tied to the tuning fork. It still stays tied to silence and what silence has failed to destroy. And that is the key point I wanted episode 1 to land. This is not just a book about escape. It is not just a book about a hidden power. It is not just a book about ruins and ancient systems and forgotten makers. It is a book about what suppression cannot finally erase: memory, grief, living force, the right to answer, the right to become more than what fear made you. That, to me, is what makes the opening so strong. It begins with a child being told to become dust, and then, over time, it becomes the story of what happens when dust begins to sing. That is a beautiful progression, and it also tells you why this works as the beginning of a series. A first book in a series has to do something very hard. It has to feel complete enough to matter, but open enough to keep widening. It has to give you a real emotional engine, a real world, a real conflict, a real reason to come back. And I think the last architect of Eterra does that by choosing the right beginning. It does not begin with maximum explanation. It begins with maximum pressure. Then it gives you just enough of the world to understand the pain, just enough of the history to sense the depth, just enough of the buried machinery to know that there is far more below. That is why I would never describe this opening as just setup. It is not passive. It is not throat clearing. It is the moral blueprint of the entire story. Silence is imposed. Resonance answers. Order tries to flatten the human core. The buried thing moves anyway. And Alit stands at the center of that collision. Before I close, I want to come back to one detail that really stays with me: the dedication. For those who inherited the silence and carried it farther than they should have. That is such a strong emotional doorway into this novel, because suddenly silence is not only world building, it becomes inheritance. It becomes a wound passed down, a survival habit, a burden people carry too long. That makes the whole book feel more intimate, more human. The underground world, the wardens, the tuning fork, the false god, the star architects, all of that matters. But what makes it hit is that inside all of it there still this deeply human experience. What do people do when fear becomes structure? What happens when survival teaches you to suppress parts of yourself for so long that silence starts to feel like identity? And what happens when something buried inside you answers back anyway? That is the beginning of Eterra. That is why the book begins where it does. That is why it begins in silence. Because the story is not about silence winning. It is about silence failing to kill what matters. That is where I want to leave episode 1. Eterra begins as a world of rust, control, pressure, and erasure. But underneath it there is pulse. Underneath it there is buried design. Underneath it there is memory. And underneath it there is Aelit, carrying a force that was never going to stay hidden forever. Next time, we're going deeper into Aelit herself. Who she is, why she works so well as the center of this story, and why her personal history is inseparable from the deeper history of Eterra. I'm Chris. Thank you for listening. And remember, what was buried is never still.